Hi, everybody, and good morning and afternoon from around the US and around the world. My name is Moshe Safran. I'm leading the US activities of RSIP Vision from the Bay Area. We do this webinar every month. Some of you have probably attended before. Normally, we talk a lot about the technical aspects and the project management aspects of AI in medical devices. Really, as a company who deals with this day in, day out, we're seeing tremendous interest and tremendous growth in this field. What we always recommend is to start addressing the regulatory aspects of the AI modules and solutions that you are developing or that we are developing early on. It's very important to protect our R&D investments and the time to market by understanding exactly what is going to be required, even during the earliest research phases, all the way through implementation. So today, in order to discuss these issues in depth, we have a special guest speaker, Yarmela Pavlovic. She's partner at Hogan Lovells, leading a law firm dealing with these issues vis-a-vis the FDA. Yarmela specifically specializes in regulatory procedures for AI in medical devices. So without further ado, Yarmela, the floor is yours.
Thanks for that introduction. That was very nice of you. And I am going to spend a little bit of time today talking. If you want to go to the next slide, I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about a few topics. One, I want to cover at a very high level what the FDA regulates. Two, I want to talk through what the basic regulatory requirements are. And three, I want to talk about the ongoing policy developments for AI specifically. Next slide. So on the topic of what does the FDA regulate, next slide. The FDA regulates things, including software, if they meet the definition of a medical device in the FDA statute. And the definition is shown on the slide, but just to paraphrase, it's a thing that's used in the treatment, diagnosis, mitigation, prevention of disease or medical condition in a person. In an individual person. It doesn't have to produce a diagnosis itself, but if the information is to be used in the care of individual patients, then generally it is understood to meet the medical device definition. That definition was the definition that we had for many, many years, from the 70s, when medical device regulation was first initiated in the US, all the way up until 2016, when the 21st Century Cures Act was passed. And 21st Century Cures Act did modify the definition of a medical device slightly to exclude certain kinds of software. By and large, those are administrative or charting, like EHR software, or software that transfers or displays medical device data. And then also certain categories of clinical decision support, which was mentioned on the slide. Folks often think of AI technology as providing clinical decision support because AI technology is used to provide tools that the clinicians may use in making decisions about their patients. But very importantly, in order for it to be carved out by 21st Century Cures, it has to be based on publicly available information, like software implementations of medical guidelines. Generally, it's understood that the more proprietary recommendations made by AI-based products tend not to be carved out. They're still actively regulated medical devices. So folks often ask, and on the slide you can see now, folks often ask, when does a product become a medical device? A thing, an algorithm, a hardware device, could be a medical device or not, depending on how it's meant to be used. So two examples here on the screen: a heart rate monitor. If you intend it to be used for fitness purposes, it may not be a medical device. If you intend it to be used to monitor, cardiovascular health in a patient, then it would be considered a regulated medical device. The same would be true in the context of algorithms. Sometimes the same algorithm could be used purely for educational purposes, to analyze, stock images, for example, to show a clinician, how to teach them how to interpret something. And in that context, it might not be a medical device, but in the context of being used in patient care, it would be considered a medical device. Next slide. Something that's very important to understand, often we talk about the concept of enforcement discretion. FDA is an enforcement agency, and like all other enforcement agencies, they have the right to decide when to enforce their requirements and when not to enforce them. Sorry, I just noticed that there may be a little bit of noise, so I'm going to try to sit back just a little bit to try to be a little bit clearer in case people were having trouble hearing me. The FDA can decide not to enforce their requirements, and when they do that, when they decide to refrain from enforcement, that is referred to as enforcement discretion. Enforcement discretion has been used pretty commonly by FDA for certain categories of digital health products. And I mention it because it comes up all the time in FDA's policies that may be relevant to companies who are developing AI-based products. So for example, FDA has a policy on general wellness products where they explain certain types of categories that may not be actively regulated. They may be under enforcement discretion. But by and large, most of the AI-based medical, whether it's physiological data analysis, medical imaging analysis, other types of analysis, most of those have been actively regulated by FDA. Next slide. All right, so if you decide, and we'll actually flip to the next slide after this, if you decide that the thing that you're talking about, including software, that it is a medical device, then there are 4 possible options. The first one is that it could be a medical device, but not actively regulated by FDA. And I just talked about that in terms of enforcement discretion. If it is actively regulated by FDA, then it is typically regulated in one of 3 classes. Those classes are based on risk, from lowest to highest risk, and the regulatory burden of the product is determined by the classification. Most class 1 products are very well characterized, very low risk, and those products generally have been exempted from any sort of pre-market review by FDA. So a company that makes a class 1 product may register and list with FDA, tell FDA where they are and what they make, and introduce those products to the market without any sort of pre-market review. Class 2 products usually enter the market through what's referred to as the 510K process, where you establish that your product is very similar to something that's already on the market. And then the class 3 products are the highest risk and use a PMA approval process, which is very similar to a drug approval process in many ways. Novel products, products that don't fit into an existing classification. FDA has a scheme of classification regulations that describe different product types. And if you have something that is novel and doesn't fit into one of those categories, then the default classification is class 3. And we use what is referred to as the de novo process to move that product from class 3 into either class 1 or class 2. Many of the AI-based products that have been cleared by FDA to date have used the de novo process. So a good example would be the IDX-DR, diabetic retinopathy screening product. That was a de novo. Some of the radiographic imaging products have been de novos. It's been quite a common process for this type of classification. Next slide. I mentioned the 510K process. Folks often want to know if they're eligible to submit a 510K. And the question is there a product that's already on the market that's like your product? And it must be like or substantially equivalent, both with respect to intended use and indications for use. And it has to have the same or very similar technological characteristics. And often, especially in the AI space, this becomes a matter of discussion with FDA. How close does it need to be to the product that's already on the market? How similar does the medical condition or the findings need to be? And how different? And that often is a point of discussion with FDA. On the other hand, if there is no available predicate because your product is doing something that's quite novel, then the de novo process would be the right process. Unless the product is class 3 because it is too high risk. Class 3 products cannot be predicates. They cannot be a basis for a 510K. And any products that are like Products that have already received a PMA would also require a PMA. Next slide. I mentioned the de novo request. The de novo request is both a process for creating a new regulatory classification and then also granting marketing authorization for the individual product. Products that follow after that are very similar, that are substantially equivalent to that original novel product, can use the 510K process to claim substantial equivalence to the original de novo product. Next slide. And finally, the PMA approval process. I will say that the vast majority of products that have been reviewed and authorized for marketing by FDA so far have been in the Class 2 space. So they either have been the subject of a 510K or they have used the de novo process. The exceptions to that are things that review very medically important imaging to make a determination about whether a disease, so screening, whether a disease is present or absent, a screening indication in average risk or asymptomatic individuals. And the thinking is that it can be very hard to second guess the software in that context. And this is true, by the way, in the in vitro diagnostic space as well. The only things that are Class 3 tend to be for very medically important conditions such as cancer, where the likelihood of being able to catch the disease without the screening tool is low. Next slide. This is just a comparison of the different types of submissions. The 510K and the de novo are actually very similar, although they carry a longer timeline for FDA review. The de novo carries a longer timeline than the 510K, but the contents are actually very similar. A PMA process additionally includes pre-market manufacturing inspections and pre-market clinical trial audits as well for data integrity and to assure that clinical trial procedures were followed appropriately. And consequently, it carries a much longer review time. This is just, oh, go ahead to the next slide. This is just a slide with the user fees for 510Ks and de novos. PMA user fees are much higher, although for a small business, a first PMA is free. But the 510Ks and the de novos, you can see here. And as a note, if you qualify as a small business, it saves you a lot of money, which you can see on the slide. It takes about 60 days to get designated as a small business, so it's good to apply for that early. Next slide. These are just some of the pre and post-market regulatory requirements we've talked about. You know, what does it take to get marketing authorization, or at least at a very high level, we've talked about that. In addition to marketing authorization, medical devices, pretty much all of them, regardless of classification, have to comply with what are referred to as general controls. And general controls include things like compliance with FDA's quality system regulation, having a quality management system in place, good record keeping and reporting requirements, things like having procedures for handling adverse event reporting, or recalls and field corrections, all those sorts of things. And then in addition, Class 2 devices may be subject to special controls, which are rules that are requirements that are written for that product type. And so when you look at a de novo clearance for a product, often FDA will include special controls outlining what must be in any future 510Ks for that product type. Next slide. Just as a quick note, clinical trials of investigational medical devices, those that don't yet have clearance or approval, are also regulated by FDA. There are different categories of studies depending on what you're doing in the study and how the product is being used. But there may be additional regulatory requirements, including if the product is going to be used in a significant risk medical condition and the output is going to be displayed to physicians, it may be that it's considered a significant risk IDE study, which would require FDA approval for the study before the study may begin. So this is just a quick note so that folks are aware. Next slide. Okay, very briefly, and then we'll open it up for questions. I just want to talk about some of the new developments from FDA, policy developments that may very well impact the way that AI-based products are regulated in the next few years. Historically, the thought has been that an algorithm-based product would be frozen and validated, and that the validated version would be cleared or approved by FDA, and that any changes to that algorithm would require an additional FDA review, an additional 510K, an additional PMA supplement. FDA recognizes that for AI-based products, there is a greater opportunity for optimizing those algorithms. Continual improvement is a possibility. And so because of that, they're looking for ways to kind of adjust their existing regulatory framework to allow for more latitude for companies to make changes without needing additional regulatory submissions. The concept is that in your initial regulatory submission, you would propose a protocol for making changes. You would define the scope of the changes you might make. And if you reach agreement with FDA on how to do that during that initial pre-market submission, then you might be able to make those changes without needing to go back to FDA. This is still a policy that's very much in development. And you can see here, this is sort of the schematic that FDA uses for, how they're thinking about model training and tuning, and, when there's an opportunity for retraining and whether that might require a 510K submission. Next slide. And the last thing I want to mention is the pre-cert program, which actually goes sort of hand in hand with the AI framework that I just described. FDA's historical approach has been to focus their pre-market review on products, individual products, rather than on companies. And companies, by and large, their processes and procedures are handled through post-market inspections. FDA has been working on a framework where they would instead focus their efforts on certifying developers or manufacturers as excellent companies. And if they achieved that sort of level of excellence, then they would be given more of a streamlined pre-market review. This has been in development since 2017. It is just now undergoing an actual pilot. They're test piloting some of the parts of the program. It's thought that it'll be a few more years at least before it's an active program for companies to rely on, but it would also allow for more latitude for changes after a product is initially on the market. And I believe that brings me to, this is just the pre-cert life cycle. The last piece I'll mention is that part of the pre-cert program involves real-world data collection after the product is already on the market, and sharing of that real-world data collection back to FDA. So it becomes more of a cyclical process as opposed to a single point-in-time review. And with that, I will open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Yarmela. It was very enlightening. So actually, from the point of view of one of the developers of these algorithms, as the representative of RSIP Vision here at this webinar, I do have a few questions of my own, and afterwards we'll be very happy to open up to questions from the audience. So I'd like to invite all of our audience members. We have a very nice attendance today. There are about 94 people on the line right now. I'd like to invite everybody to start typing in your questions, and we'll relay some of them to Yarmela in a moment. So at one of our products at RSIP Vision, we created a segmentation for airways for a pulmonary procedure. We trained it at about 1,000 CT scans. So a few questions came up during the course of the development of this module. First of all, does the FDA generally only ask sort of about the results of the algorithm on the test set? Does it care mainly about the phenomenological performance of an algorithm, or do they ask many detailed questions about the training procedure itself? I mean, how deep does the FDA go into the details of how the algorithm was created, as opposed to looking at how the algorithm is actually performing in the real world?
So they do care about both. I would say that the majority of the review is focused on the validation as opposed to the training, except that they want information about the training and the training data sets to understand whether there are potential for biases in the resulting algorithm. And for example, do the test set and the training set look too similar? Are they from the same site, for example? Are they from the same data set? Where are there opportunities to enhance the validation so that it's a more representative test of how it will perform in real commercial use? So they care about both, slightly more emphasis placed on validation.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's a very sort of data-driven, evidence-based procedure. Another question is, how does one decide on the size of the test set? So for training, obviously, the more the better, but what determines the required size of the test set in order to get approval?
It's usually determined based on a statistical sample size justification, depending on what types of things you're trying to prove in your validation. So for example, if the algorithm is meant to detect the presence of a particular disease or condition or a lesion type, for example, then the expectation, usually we would use sensitivity and specificity for that binary output. And the expectation would be that you would have a sufficiently sized sample size to prove with statistical significance that your performance is above whatever is the clinically relevant threshold for performance.
Thank you. Okay, one more question, and then we'll pass it on to the audience questions. People are sending in quite a number of questions and queries. This is coming from a different example, segmentation algorithm for knee replacement surgery. And here what we found when we moved to the validation phase is that when we had experts, radiologists who are very experienced with these images, annotate them themselves, we found surprisingly high level of variance between the experts. They don't always completely agree with each other. So how does this tie in to the FDA processes, and how is this typically taken into account?
So typically we handle that by using a panel of readers or a panel of experts to provide clinical truth. Sometimes clinical truth, by the way, is also informed by other data pieces of information, right? Other clinical information that's available beyond the imaging itself. But when it's based on the imaging, or even when it's in addition to other pieces of information, often a panel of experts is used to provide a more robust assessment. And there are varying ways to do that, whether you take majority rule or whether you use some more collaborative approach, round robin. There's different ways to do it, and each of them have their pros and cons, but that's generally the way that the variability between readers is handled.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to start with a question from James Guzetta. Actually, it's pretty connected to what you were describing before about how to regulate ongoing training. So if AI algorithms are used for continuing offline product development, does the acceptance criteria change?
I'm not sure that I perfectly understand the question. It is usually up to the developer or manufacturer to define the criteria for performance and then agree with FDA on that during leading up to your marketing submission and during the marketing submission itself. If the product is continuing to be updated after the initial marketing submission, then it would be subject to an additional review, or if you've already agreed with FDA on a protocol for changes, then you probably have outlined the specifications for performance during that process.
Yeah, actually it brings to mind a different example. Also, let's say we have an algorithm that's dealing with a specific class of objects in an image, and we want to constantly retrain it on new objects. So there are similar objects, but they have never been viewed before. Would that require a whole new submission, or can that be dealt with ahead of time, so to speak?
So the historical view right now, without this new framework that FDA is working on, is that if you change the algorithm in a 510K or de novo cleared product, you have to go back again. Change the core algorithm, you have to go back for a new submission. The goal of what FDA is working on is to develop a framework so that companies wouldn't need to do that, because they would have agreed with FDA on procedures for changing it during the initial review.
Okay. Next question from Corey Hatcher. How are the FDA regulations different if the product is not directly sold, i.e. we deliver it as an analysis output to the customer, and the software tool is maintained internally? So in other words, what happens if you're using AI internally and you're only delivering the output to the customer? I can think of maybe sort of a CRO type of situation, but there may be others as well.
Yeah, in general, the rules are the same. So FDA reviews the thing, whether it's to be used internally, and they have long not recognized this concept of having software that's used by a company to provide a service, an interpretation service. There are some exceptions to that, but by and large, FDA would view the software as regulated either way. And so the rules would be the same, because once they're reviewing, they review the thing that they have in front of them. There are circumstances in which products, this is more in the in vitro diagnostic space and hasn't really been done in the AI space, but there are instances in which products are really only authorized for marketing in a specific, they're only used in one location. So we think of single lab labeling in vitro diagnostics. I haven't seen that done in AI products, but I suppose it is possible for it to be done in that context.
Okay, different question coming from Jim Schindler. How is the FDA proposed protecting trade secrets inherent in self-learning algorithms? Do you see any connection between these two topics?
So there are many products where there's trade secret or proprietary information that's shared with FDA during the review process, and those are protected, and they are not to be disclosed in, for example, a FOIA request, so they would be redacted. That's true whether it's an AI algorithm or it's some other kind of technology. So FDA has existing procedures for handling that.
Okay, a couple of more specific questions from Sophie Weisenberg about the 510K process. So first of all, are the exact statistical methods for testing equivalence detailed in the FDA regulations? Is a calibration of the algorithm that does not significantly change product performance compared to labeling claims require an additional 510K? Or could this be done in a letter to file?
Yeah, I'll take those in reverse order. The answer to the second one is the same as we were talking about before, which is historically FDA's view has been that if you change the algorithm, even if it's to result in very similar performance, you may need to go back for a new marketing submission. So the default assumption is that you would likely need a new 510K. To answer the other question, which is, do the regulations say exactly what must be proven to establish substantial equivalence? No, they do not. And that is typically a point of discussion and negotiation with FDA.
So yeah, how does that usually work? Do the statistical criteria usually come from the developer themselves, and then that starts a dialogue from the FDA? Or, I mean, how to what extent are there predetermined criteria, and to what extent is it really application dependent and sort of initiated by the player who actually develops the solution itself?
So sometimes a product gets cleared by FDA and there is sufficient information available about exactly what they had to do to establish the performance of their product that a competitor can basically follow along behind, do the same thing, provide the same data to FDA, and obtain a 510K clearance. In other cases, it's less clear, or maybe the product has nuanced differences that require further discussion with FDA. And in those cases, typically, it's recommended that the developer or manufacturer talk to FDA through the pre-submission process, which is sort of a precursor to the marketing submission, where you submit a background package and you have a meeting with FDA and get feedback on your plans. And I would say that as a general matter, it is always better for the developer or manufacturer to make a proposal for what they believe is the right way to approach a problem, provide a justification for why that's the right way, and let FDA react to that. That tends to be much more efficient and effective than asking FDA more open-ended questions.
Yeah, I think that answers a few more questions I'm seeing here about feedback on test plans, etc. Question from Dino DeSico. What is the impact of FDA guidance on human factors and usability validation studies relative to AI? Related to a previous question, actually, what guidance is there for risk management relative to AI hazards and harms? So, yeah, what is the standard guidance provided here?
So on risk management, I mean, we typically look to the same risk management standards that we use for other types of medical devices, which is 14971, ISO 14971 standard, and the associated risk management processes and procedures. And the general idea is you're trying to identify all of the possible failure modes for the product and all of the associated potential risks, and make sure that you've put in place appropriate mitigations. On human factors specifically, which is sort of an offshoot of risk management, human factors tends to be more focused on user interface and understanding label comprehension, that sort of thing. It is most common for products that either have a very complex user interface where there's real significant potential for use-related error, or lay use products. Lay use products generally are assumed to have potential for error and therefore need human factors validation. Clinician, physician-facing products less commonly have human factors validation, although human factors might be one of the things you think about when it comes to risk management. But in terms of separate validation, it's much more common for lay user-facing products, and then for products that have a real potential for serious injury or harm because of the physician interaction with the product.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we're going to take 2 additional questions, and then we'll adjourn. The first question from Salman Hamid is asking if an algorithm is used for image enhancement to make the visualization of an image look better. Does it need FDA clearance? Does it make any difference if the algorithm is based on AI or not? Actually, this question is from miscrediting, but basically, if it's just used to enhance the image, will that need a clearance as well?
I think it would depend on what's meant by enhance, but if it is affecting the diagnostic quality of the image, then yes, I would assume that it would. I mean, you go back to the same sort of concept of, is it being used in the diagnosis, treatment, prevention, the care of an individual patient? And if the answer to that is yes, then there's a pretty good chance that it may be FDA regulated, although it would be up to the specifics of what it's doing.
Okay. We're going to go one more question from Tauzel. Actually, we've also come across this issue many times. How does the FDA regulate the algorithms that are used in a user-in-the-loop fashion? So if you have a human in the loop, and I've also encountered this personally, how should the performance metrics be set for these cases, since the user themselves is gating the final accuracy?
Those types of products are usually validated using reader studies or multi-center, multi-image studies where we have readers. There's different designs, but you might have a human use the software, do like an aided and an unaided analysis of the image or the data or whatever it is, and you compare with a washout period in between their aided and unaided, and you compare, you know, how do they do, what's their performance like when they use the software, what's their performance like when they don't use the software. I mean, in general, we're trying to confirm that it provides some value and doesn't make the people worse, right? That's the very basic way of saying it. What that requires is very dependent on the medical condition and the clinical context and how time sensitive the analysis is, but you know, that's sort of the basic way that we handle it.
So it would become a completely a clinical study. This is something that would need to be verified very much in the field. The more the human is in the loop, the more it needs to be verified based on the performance of physicians themselves at multiple sites, rather than just measuring statistics on the software in a way that's not inherently connected to the use cases.
That's correct. I mean, the thing that you're usually assessing, we sometimes also will assess the underlying performance of the algorithm, but you also want to know what's the impact on the physician when they're using it.
Yeah, that's definitely always a very important case, even from an R&D perspective, and obviously from a regulatory perspective, to really get a feel for how the system is being used in the real world, and obviously to verify that this isn't causing any problems and that it's making the physician's life easier. And many times that's actually feeding back the R&D process itself to tweak the system, or even just to tweak the user experience in order to make it more useful. Okay, so thank you very much, Yarmela. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that to say that could be done in the context of, you might use retrospective images, existing data sets of images to do those reader studies. So it doesn't necessarily mean out in the field, but yes, you want to evaluate the performance with and without the algorithm.
Okay, thank you very much. Please feel free to shoot me an email maybe with any additional questions, and we'll try to field them as well. We should have this recording of this webinar up on YouTube. We'll update everybody about that. And we'll be happy to see you all, or some of you, at least, in our future webinars. It's about once a month. You'll get an update by email, as well as our meetup. It's October 2nd in Cupertino. You should be receiving updates about that as well. Thank you very much, and have a great day. Bye-bye.